Before time, there was nothing. And then? As the universe expanded from an infinitesimal point, great beings from other dimensions seeped into our reality, fleeing an incomprehensible conflict known as the Great Celestial War. As gravity compressed hydrogen into higher elements around them, the great gods slept, curling up to heal. Around one, a small blue planet formed, and as a young species on its surface grew, the great Earth Dragon, as the godlike being would become known, started to stir. In the early 20th century, some men and women started to develop great powers beyond any other. With the advent of these superheroes, the world, once very much like our own, would never be the same again. These are the stories of the Mirage universe, and you're listening to the Mirage Barrage. You wake up one day and discover you have superpowers. One way or another, you've been transformed into something more powerful. You decide you want to use your powers for something good. You find someone who also has power, but who doesn't share your same sense of restraint. When he starts his rampage, you stand up to him, and you win. You beat him, you save your neighborhood, your city, maybe even the world. You did good. You wake up the next day to a knock at your door. It's some government spooks in black that tell you have to stop. That, or you now work for them. What do you do? For most supers, the choice isn't that abrupt, but it still has to be made. Some can get away with going unnoticed and unregistered if they have a subtle, non-dangerous power, but everyone is expected to register. To some people, this makes sense. Superpowers are often more or less weapons, and sometimes weapons of mass destruction at that. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the thought of this much power walking around without supervision, so the government keeps a public registry. And if you want to be a hero, you have to work with the Federal Hero Agency or a similar state or municipal program. But to other people, this is concerning. Sure, having walking superweapons might be scary, but do you know what's scarier, these people ask? Giving the government these superweapons. These people point to many secret government projects featuring supers, some of which have toppled governments and secretly policed the world. Unaccountable secret agents with nigh unlimited power. But on the other hand, without someone watching them, where does the line fall between unsanctioned hero and simple villain? Shouldn't the public have a deciding voice on what is and is not permitted? Some might prefer a common compromise, municipal heroes. Large cities will oversee local heroes rather than leaving it up to distant bureaucrats. For many, this works well, but it's still not enough for others. Especially some heroes. Some don't want to be known by anyone. Some just want to don the costume when they see something heading their way so they can fight back. They don't want the job, they're just willing to step up to the plate when the time comes. And when you get someone like that, all of these questions about who is responsible don't really matter. And so, Phoenix, Arizona didn't much mind that Invincible never registered with the city, or the state, or the federal government. In fact, he was celebrated, because when a threat showed up to their city, he would be there, and nothing could get past him. As his rather direct name implied, he was indestructible and beyond strong to boot, a simple but highly effective power combination. His costume was as simple as it was ostentatious, a navy blue outfit with a large gold eye down the middle, the top and bottom of which forming his shoulder pads and belt respectively. Top it off with some boots and a visor, which surely had some high-tech gadgets to alter the visible portions of his face, and you had his costume. Instantly recognizable and as simple and direct as the man behind it. In the few guerrilla interviews with the unsanctioned hero, he came across as likable and confident, though some claimed to notice a touch of sorrow underneath this demeanor. Either way, he was a beloved figure not just in Phoenix, but across the nation. Numerous threats were ended prematurely due to Invincible's intervention, until suddenly, 2 years ago, he stopped appearing. When the Battle of Armageddon happened, he was nowhere to be found. And when it appeared, he wasn't there either. The teenage boy sprinted from the damaged movie theater, dragging his girlfriend behind him. The once brilliantly lit theater was now crumbling after the Battle of Armageddon. Like the rest of Phoenix, it had taken a beating from the arrayed armies of the usurper, and was now left to crumble. The teenagers thought the relatively intact structure would make for an interesting hangout spot. Until it showed up. Another beefy teenager suddenly soared through the air. Thrown from a shattered window, he landed in a heap several feet from his fleeing friends. "Alex!" the girl cried. Alex, the teenager, picked himself up, dusting off his jacket. "Get out of here, Lisa!" he shouted back. "I'll distract it!" "Are you crazy?" Lisa shouted, but her boyfriend kept dragging her along and leapt into the nearby car. Just as the engine turned over, 2 metal tentacles shot out from the theater and wrapped up Alex's limbs. Lisa and her boyfriend stared in horror as it, the thing, burst from the abandoned building. The pointed metal head had no apparent eyes and rested on a roughly heart-shaped body, like 2 insect torsos fused together side by side. From each half, each chamber of the thorax emerged the long, twisting metal appendages, 3 rows of 4 legs on each half, 12 on each side total, a mass of 24 tentacles emerging from the pale eggshell-colored body. Only a few were needed to raise the small torso, the size of half a man, and the rest swirled above and beside the machine, except for the 2 that wrapped themselves around Alex, and the 3 holding up the limp bodies of the other teenagers. They hung lifeless, being dangled by their heads 15 feet above the ground. Another tentacle shot out and latched onto Alex's head. Lisa screamed as her boyfriend slammed on the gas. The monster released Alex's limbs, but lifted him by the head. His eyes glazed over. He tried clawing at the metal limb, but his arms became feebler and feebler. Finally, they dropped to his side, lifeless. The car raced off, throwing up dust and dirt in its wake. The creature dropped the bodies of their friends and flew after them, legs carrying it swiftly and smoothly after its fleeing prey. The driver spun down onto the main road and pressed down harder on the accelerator. And then the car was lifted into the air. No matter how hard the pedal was pressed, the car's wheels merely spun uselessly. "Oh my God," Lisa said, staring out her window to the ground several feet below. And then the car split. The monster's limbs tore into the car and ripped it into several pieces, spilling out the fleshy contents within, who were quickly scooped up by even more tentacles. Lisa screamed as she was lifted by her ankles. The creature turned her, and she saw her boyfriend, limp and lifeless, being held up by a tentacle gripping his forehead tightly. She screamed again, and then another tentacle raised itself and faced her. "No, no, please, no!" she cried, and then the tentacle struck. Ana Garcia Vasquez ran past the soldiers lined up behind the concrete barrier. As soon as she was past them, they closed the gap and aimed their guns towards the threat beyond. In the morning light, the tentacles gleamed as the spider-like machine rounded the corner. Framed by buildings on either side of the street, the creature raised itself 10 feet into the air on its long, thin tendrils. The soldiers immediately opened fire on the thing looming ahead of them. The cracks echoed through the street as hundreds of bullets glanced off of the white shell. Even when they struck the silvery limbs, they left only small nicks and no real damage. Another soldier ran forward with a rocket launcher and fired. The rocket flew straight into the body of the strange creature and exploded. A cloud of dark smoke spat out from the impact point. The soldiers paused for a brief moment. And then the smoke was batted aside by the tendrils and the monster burst into the open once more. The soldiers spat out another wave of fire just as Ana Garcia leapt towards the back of the large army truck. The truck was crammed full of other people fleeing the city as well, and at the sight of the approaching conflict, a thin man stood up and banged on the back of the truck's cabin. "Go! Go!" he shouted to the driver. The truck's engine rumbled and it sped off just as Ana was leaping inside. She stumbled and kept running after the speeding vehicle. A huge, muscular man with dirty blonde hair bolted to the back of the truck and outstretched his hand. "Jump!" Michael Mason called out to the stumbling woman. She immediately obeyed, leaping with all her force towards the moving vehicle. Michael caught her in midair and pulled her inside. The truck hit a pothole and the back dipped dangerously as she was pulled in. She reached out a hand to catch herself and fell hard on it. She let out a gasp as she hit the floor and rolled to the side. She cradled her hand as it throbbed in pain. Michael leaned over and helped her up against the wall of the truck. "You okay?" he asked. Ana nodded. She winced as she adjusted her arm. A tall, thin man with a light brown beard leaned over next to her. "May I?" he asked in a smooth voice, gesturing towards Anna's wrist. "I'm a doctor." "Go ahead," Ana said. "But the way it feels, I'm betting it's a scaphoid fracture." The man carefully handled her wrist, and she winced in sudden piercing pain. "Good guess," he said. "Are you a doctor? Nurse?" "Freelance journalist," Anna replied. "I've had more than a few rough stories." "Ah," the doctor replied, then extended his hand. "Max Weller, by the way." Anna took his hand and shook it firmly. "Ana Garcia Vasquez." A tremendous thud behind them drew their attention back to the scene outside. Soldiers were being thrown through the air, many of whom were being grasped by their heads, apparently drained by the monstrosity. "Where are the heroes?" Anna muttered under her breath at the insane scene. Dr. Weller glanced over towards Michael. If Anna weren't distracted by her broken wrist, she might have caught how the large man's muscles tightened and his fist clenched at her comment. Louis Bannister, an old man with a tussle of gray hair and gray beard contrasting his dark skin and severe black button-down, put a hand discreetly on Michael's back. His warm bronze eyes, which stood out from his outfit, offered comfort. "It's not your fault," he whispered. Michael slowly, hesitantly, unclenched his fist. June 2018. Invincible had won yet again, but there was no time to celebrate. The military personnel at the expo were from all over the country, and while many of the Arizona natives had a great respect for Invincible, others saw their opportunity to bag a notoriously unaffiliated super. Running up the stairs to the roof, Invincible felt that something was different, but he didn't have time to put the pieces together. A squad of soldiers was right behind him. If everything was going according to plan, he might still have a way out of this. He burst onto the roof in the chilly night air and immediately ran towards the edge. He'd have a few seconds before the soldiers caught up with him. Not that he was worried they'd be able to hurt him. No, he was worried as to whether or not he could give his driver enough time to get out of sight. He reached the ledge just as he heard the soldiers reach the roof, and Invincible jumped. There was the unmarked van. Perfect. He just had to dive in and... Splintering pain radiated up his calves. It was so sudden that it took him a while to realize the obvious. It had come from when he hit the ground from several stories up. His legs felt shattered. But how? Before his mind could cope with the pain, he saw Max's face. He had jumped out of the back of the van and was now hauling the giant man inside. As he slammed the doors closed behind him, and Carmen slammed her foot on the pedal, Invincible, aka Michael Mason, stared up at the ceiling of the van. Slowly, the pieces started to fit together, and he realized why he had felt so different than before. His powers were gone. Sitting on Max's couch, both legs wrapped in casts, Michael barely paid attention to the TV. He was still lost in thought, barely comprehending the events of a month ago. He didn't even realize that he could lose his powers. Thinking about it, he guessed that he'd pushed himself pretty far, but still, this was unprecedented. Max stepped through the door, his hands occupied with a big bag of groceries. "Hey, Mike," he said. "How are the legs?" "Fine," Mike said, not really paying attention. "We've done all we can." "Short of going to a hospital, of course," Max replied. Both knew that was out of the question. The squad of soldiers had gotten a glimpse of Invincible being dragged into the van, and they might well be still searching for hospitals for anyone who showed up with 2 broken legs. Fortunately for him, Max was a doctor. A little scrounging around and maybe a little borrowing of equipment, and he had made sure Michael's legs were set and casted as well as anyone could expect. "Sorry about the van," Mike mumbled. He had meant to bring it up earlier but never found the opportunity, so he snuck it in now. They had to trash it too because it had been seen. Max shrugged. "It was a piece of crap," he said. "Just like the others." Mike felt a knot in his stomach. They had gone through a few vans this way and unfortunately had gotten rather good at scrubbing them down and trashing them. While they bought them cheap for this very reason, the money added up. And with Mike out of work at the moment, that just meant more burdens falling onto Max. And as a young doctor, he already had plenty to pay off. The news changed to an ongoing battle downtown. Yet another sighting of the new villain called Whip Crack. He could move at lightning speed for a millisecond, leaving just a hint of a trail of energy behind him, which would then crack in a giant outburst, shockwaves destroying everything within 50 feet. He was a tricky one to fight, and very hard to catch. You would think he would be easy to track, leaving destruction in his wake, but he must be able to suppress the cracks if he chose, because he had slipped away several times now. "Mike," Max said slowly, Mike tore his eyes away from the TV, towards Max's concerned expression. Only then did he realize that he was clenching his fingers on the armrest of the couch. He forced himself to relax. "I know, there's nothing I can do," he sighed between his teeth. "No, I was going to say there's nothing you need to do," Max corrected. "It's going to be all right." And then, on the screen, Firewing appeared. This was Phoenix's native sanctioned hero, as if the name didn't scream that enough. Michael, as Invincible, had run into him several times on missions, and while Firewing was initially happy to help, his attitude slowly changed. Firewing grew jealous. If you were to ask anyone on the street who the big superhero from Phoenix was, they'd answer Invincible, obviously. And as the official hero of Phoenix, this just burned Firewing up. On the screen, he wasted no time in leaping into action. Firewing's ability allowed him to manipulate the pressure or density and temperature of objects around him. With just an added spark, this meant he could easily create and control flames, in addition to several other tricks. One of these, for example, was his signature collapsing wings. While too small to allow flight normally, by manipulating air pressure around them, Firewing was more than able to achieve and maintain flight. All in all, he was a decent, if showy, hero. His all-white uniform and bright, colorful flames he often decorated himself with attested to that. But Whipcrack might be a bit too much for his powers to catch. But even as Michael thought that, Firewing surprised him. After each of the villain's cracks, Firewing altered the air pressure to negate the explosive force the speedster was creating. He then tried to create several walls of fire to corner Whipcrack. That's not going to work, Michael thought, and as soon as that had entered his mind, Whipcrack demonstrated his point by zipping through the fire too fast to be burned. But as he zipped through a second wall of flame, he suddenly tripped and collapsed. The sidewalk under him had been torn to pieces. Firewing had weakened it, making it less dense, and his flame walls had blocked Whipcrack's sight, so the villain never saw it coming. "See?" Max said. "Things are going to be okay." "Yeah," Michael said. "I guess they are." He leaned back into the couch and felt more depressed than before. He was glad that other heroes out there could deal with rogue supers who popped up now and again, but he still felt worse after seeing how easily Firewing took care of Whipcrack. It wasn't jealousy, and it certainly wasn't that he'd miss the spotlight. Every once in a while, after a difficult fight, it felt good to give a big grin and maybe mug for the cameras a little, but only after one of those wins. Most of the time, he preferred to stay unknown. There was a reason he was unsanctioned, after all. "Come on, Michael," Max said. "Let's go out and get a bite to eat." "I don't feel like it tonight," Mike said. "Louis would like to see you." Mike glanced back over at Max. He still didn't feel like going, but Max was being insistent. He might as well. Michael Mason took a big bite from his burger. Louis' Bar and Grill had been a favorite hangout spot for Mike and Max since as long as they could remember. At first, they would frequent the place with their families, but as they grew older and had some petty cash to spend themselves, they would still wander in just to hang out. Louis, the owner, knew them well, and also became a fast friend, even though he was far older than the two. Louis was everyone's friend, which was partly accomplished through the neighborhood mainstay that was his restaurant, and partly through his outgoing, warm, and ever-friendly demeanor. For their part, Mike and Max had been friends since middle school. They parted for a period when they went their different ways after high school graduation. Mike dabbled in a few programs in technical schools and wound up as a mechanic, while Max pursued his goal of becoming a doctor. But as different as their paths were, when they reunited after college, they found they fell back into the same habits as before they left. And when Michael's powers manifested, Max was the first to know. And after one hard, rainy night when Max was struck by debris from a fight, they brought him to Louis', a place they knew with someone they could trust. Now that Michael had lost his powers, it seemed Louis also wanted to try to cheer him up. "I'm sorry, we don't serve your kind," Louis said, standing over the two. Mike rolled his eyes. "What, you think we're going to bring down the reputation of this establishment?" Max asked. "Hate to break it to you, but with you running the shop, it can't sink much lower." "Well, well, well," Louis said, mock-offended. "These were going to be on the house, but I guess not anymore." He plopped down a couple of bottles of cream soda. "How generous," Mike mumbled before swallowing his bite. "You know we're not kids anymore, right?" Max said. Maybe a couple of beers next time? You two drink? Louis asked, squinting his eyes as if trying to make out something on Max's face. You still look 14, even with that scraggly curtain on your chin. Louis plopped onto a seat next to him. How's it going, guys? Doing pretty good, all things considered, Mike said, clacking his leg casts together. Max stopped rubbing his beard as if checking the consistency to reply, Busy, Louis, always busy. And you? This place safe with you stepping out of the kitchen for a while? Louis waved a hand dismissively. I give them half an hour before they screw anything major up. A few rounds of joyous conversation, inside jokes, and general foolishness later, and Louis finally turned on a serious face. He turned to Mike. So, what are you thinking of doing now? Mike slowly set down the fry he was about to eat. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, what are you going to do? Work, life, any plans? Mike shrugged. Louis sighed softly. It's been a month, and I'd be lying if I said I knew what you were going through, but Max and I are a bit worried. You still got a lot of life ahead of you, and there's no sense wasting it. So, we were wondering if you had any thoughts. What do you want to do? Now Michael sighed. He had a sneaking suspicion this was going to be brought up at some point. He didn't much care for this intervention-style conversation, but at the same time, there wasn't really any fight in him. I don't know, he said. I thought about maybe going back to the shop, keep being a mechanic. Max nodded. Okay, cool. That something you want to do? Louis asked, supportive but not convinced. I guess. Let me put it this way. Is it something you want to do, or is this just a job you think you can do? I don't think there is a job that I really want to do, Mike replied. But that's having a job, isn't it? Louis laughed. True enough, he said. Well, to cut to the chase, Max and I had an idea. Why not come work here? Michael just about choked as he was drinking his soda. After a cough, he sputtered, Work here? I don't know anything about cooking. Real question is, would you have any interest in learning? I never thought about it. I've never tried. Why would you want me? I've had to babysit most of the cooks when they first started, Louis said. I've gotten pretty good at teaching people what they need to know. One of my cooks is quitting pretty soon, and yeah, you're not exactly my first choice. Except, you need a pick-me-up. If you turn out to be a good fit with the team, maybe what you need is an environment with a good team where you can feel at home while being productive. What do you think? Michael thought about that for a moment. He shrugged. I'd give it a shot, he said unenthusiastically. Michael wasn't a bad fit. Louis started him off slow, and Michael took his responsibilities seriously. It took him a while to get used to the speed of the kitchen and keeping track of multiple orders, but he slowly adjusted and was intent on learning. It was also tough with his lack of mobility. While Mike still seemed pretty down, Max and Louis reserved judgment until he had plenty of time back on his feet, literally and figuratively. As the months passed by and no sign of Michael's powers returned, Max, who had taken on the task of trying to figure out why they had vanished, started to let the project slip. And Mike's mood was as gray as always. 6 months in, and Max and Louis started brainstorming a new plan. Which is why, on the rare days when both Louis and Mike were off, the older man dragged Michael into a boxing ring. You sure you can handle this, old man? Mike had asked the first time they had stepped into the ring together. It may have been a few years since I was in my prime, but I can still teach you a thing or two, Louis said confidently. You used to box? Put your hands up and I'll show you the answer. And so once or twice a month, Louis taught him the ropes. The two didn't seriously fight each other, even though Louis quickly impressed upon Michael how much he knew about the violent sport. He was no match for the muscly young man. Instead, Louis taught him the basics, helped with his technique, and set him up for his first couple of bouts with people more his speed. Michael was more than used to a scuffle, and surely, Louis and Max had figured, the adrenaline rush from boxing would help satisfy the former hero. But just like with work, as attentive as he was, and as quick as he learned, his actions were mechanical, automatic, and detached. Michael was still out there. Hands up, Louis instructed. Michael was still greasy from the day's work and only half-heartedly raised his fists to cover his face. Louis shook his head in disappointment and lightly jabbed at Michael, quickly lowering his deflated defenses and bopping him in the head. All right, Michael said. He raised his hands more seriously, and after a few more jabs from Louis, he was once more struck with a hook to his ear. Michael sighed. Look, I'm just not in the zone tonight. Let's call it good. 3 weeks until your bout with the bruiser, Louis reminded him. You pack a wallop and can knock him to the floor just as long as you can stay on your feet. Practice makes perfect. A little more and you'll be untouchable, kid. Michael swatted away a few more light jabs from Louis. I'll practice later, Michael said dismissively. I'm tired, I'm sore, I'm going home. Don't you want to win? Louis prodded. 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes here is another 5 seconds you'll be beating on Mendoza. You gonna be ready? Michael more seriously raised his guard, but only to step a bit closer to Louis. He was moving to end their exercise one way or another. Who cares? He said, and then Louis walloped him in the jaw. Shocked and tasting some of his own blood, Michael took several steps back. Louis's face was gripped with frustration and anger. After a moment of silence, he started to rip off his gloves. All right, fine, he said. We're done. Go home. What was that about? Michael demanded. It was nothing. Forget about it, Louis said, fuming. Who cares, right? What's gotten into you? Michael demanded. He couldn't remember seeing Louis like this before. Who cares? Are you mad about what I said about the fight? It doesn't matter. Do what you want, Louis said as he finished packing his gear. Hey man, sorry I didn't take to your favorite hobby as much as you, but that was uncalled for. Michael, I don't care whatsoever whether you like my hobby or not, or I wouldn't if you would take to anything. What? Open your eyes, Michael. Max, I, and plenty of others have tried our best to help you, but we can't put the spark back in you. If you want to mope around, fine, but from this point on, just know that your misery is your own fault. Louis turned to leave as Michael stood stunned, mulling over what he had said. As he left the gym, he felt a little flare of anger well up within him as well. Yes, Max and Louis had done plenty, but what did they expect? A second-hand job and hobby were not going to bring back a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Michael appreciated their help, but they just didn't understand. Come on, Max insisted, dragging Michael to Louis' bar. One way or another, we're putting this behind us. Mike rubbed his chin where he had been hit. It was starting to feel better, but that didn't mean he had any desire to see Louis. Max passed Mike a drink and noticed the uncertainty in his friend's face. Hey, I agree with you. What Louis did crossed a line, and if we're going to move past this, he's going to have to apologize. Yeah, Mike agreed sullenly. Louis finally appeared. The place was closed, and only the 3 of them were left in the restaurant. Louis raised his eyebrow at Max, who had already helped himself, but didn't comment. Louis reached behind the counter and served himself his own drink. After a few tense pleasantries exchanged between Max and Louis, Max confronted him. So Louis, I think you wanted to say something to Michael, right? Louis lowered his glass. Yeah, you're right. He turned towards Mike, looking him in the eye. Sorry about what I did. I was out of line. And not just about what I did, but what I said. You have the right to do what you want to do with your life, and I was being stupid for getting upset. Michael shrugged. All right, apology accepted, he said. Truth be told, the direct sincerity of the message took him a bit off guard, sneaking past his defenses. It made him feel uncomfortable, and he wanted to quickly change the subject. Max almost obliged him. So, what do you think? You like working here? You want to stay on? Michael took a sip and thought about his answer. Yeah, I'm good to stay on. It's a nice enough place to work. Why not? That's what I like to hear, Louis said. So listen, if you're staying, we gotta make sure there's no bad blood between us, so hit me. What? Michael laughed, but Louis was already out from behind the bar and waving Mike over. Go on, let's get even, Louis said. Only way to be sure. You're kidding. I'd break your jaw. Then do it lightly if you want. Come on, let's do it, Louis insisted. Words are all good and fine, but this is how we really get past this stuff. Besides, we have a doctor here. I cannot condone this, Max said, eyebrows nearly reaching his hairline. You're nuts, Louis. I'm not nuts. Nuts to all the mushy talk. We settle this nice and quick, like men, he answered. Mike looked at Max and then towards Louis. No? Look, man, don't make me order you to do it, Louis said. You get me back or we can't work together anymore. Mike laughed. Punch me or you're fired. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be punch me and you're fired, Max said. How hard did you hit him? Stop whimpering over there and do it, Louis said. I'm not scared of you, big boy. Michael shook his head and stood up. Okay, but I'm just doing this so you'll drop it. Tell yourself whatever you need to. Just hurry up and do it, Louis said. I don't have all day. Now I just want it clear that you asked for this. Hurry up and do it, chicken. You do know what you're getting into. Sounds like you're backing out. Come on, chicken. Michael lightly jabbed out with his left arm, striking Louis's chin. Louis toppled backward and knocked over one of his tables. Oh, Max said, quickly jumping to his feet, he and Michael quickly picking Louis back up. I warned you, Mike said. I did not hit you that hard, Louis protested. You what? You were not messing around when you took your swing. You literally asked for it, Louis, Max said. I thought you were going to go lighter, Louis replied. I'm an old man, don't you know? That's not what you were saying a second ago. I feel like I've been kissed by a Tokyo bullet train, Louis proclaimed, rubbing his jaw. Let me see, Max said. There's no real damage, you're fine. You need to go back to school if you think this is fine, Louis retorted. I get another shot at you to make up for that one. What? No, Michael exclaimed. You said this would make us even. As Louis sputtered a response, Max started laughing. Slowly at first, but then more and more uncontrollably. Not when you punch like a drunk kangaroo, Louis replied. I get another shot. A deal's a deal. You hit me and I quit. Quit? I don't think so. You hit me. I'm firing you. You said I was fired if I didn't. Make up your mind, geezer. Okay, fine. A jab to the shoulder, then. No! And the silly argument carried on until eventually older memories were dragged into the fight, and soon the three were laughing and reminiscing late into the night. Louis was drowsily leaning against the bar as Michael finished locking up the drinks. If I take him home, are you good to finish locking up here? Max asked. I can lock up, no problem, Mike replied. But I'll take the old man home. You have an early shift. You sure? Michael waved the question off. Yeah, it's no problem. He's close by anyway. Max nodded. Thanks, man. Take care. Michael returned the nod. After making sure everything in the restaurant was taken care of, he hooked Louis's hand around his shoulder and started carrying him to his car. He'd have to come back for his motorcycle. Louis lightly jabbed, more like poked, at Michael's shoulder. There, he slurred. Now we're even. Mike laughed. Okay, whatever you say, old-timer. Old-timer, I can still handle you. Just give me a minute to wake up. Yeah, sure thing, Michael laughed. When he half-carried Louis into his house, Michael made his way to the bedroom, but Louis stopped him. I need some water, he said. Good idea, Michael replied and started to turn, but Louis pushed himself off of the younger man. I can do it, he insisted. Mike raised his hands. Okay, if you say so. As Louis went off towards the kitchen, Michael looked around. He had only been in Louis's place maybe once before, despite their long friendship. He wasn't sure why that was, as it had never come up in conversation. But the peek into Louis's inner sanctum was intriguing. An upright piano in the corner of the living room caught his eye. He hadn't figured Louis as the musical type. Michael walked over and opened the lid. Recalling one of the two tunes he knew, he tried plinking out the riff from Black Sabbath's Iron Man. Oof. Louis, you need to get this thing tuned, Michael said over his shoulder. Louis walked in from the kitchen with his glass of water. Don't touch that, he said seriously. Sorry, Michael said, suddenly bashful at his rudeness. Louis waved it off. If you don't know how to play, then don't, he said in a more jovial tone. You're embarrassing yourself. Michael helped Louis into his bed, and it wasn't long before he was sound asleep. Mike thought long and hard about his next move. He could probably just go home, and that would be fine. Then again, part of him wanted to make sure Louis would be okay in the morning. It might be an imposition, but Mike decided to play it safe. He found the couch and lay down on it. As he stretched, getting comfortable for the night, he heard something clatter to the floor. Oops. His foot had knocked over something, a picture frame as it turned out. Mike may have been a bit large for the couch after all. Resolving to be more careful, he picked up the picture and after checking there was no damage, replaced it on the end table by the arm of the couch. Huh, Michael thought. It was of a woman he didn't recognize, sitting next to the piano, but in another house. She was caught in what appeared to be a candid shot, having just noticed the camera, head turning, with a slight smile of surprise. It was a very crisp photo for catching her in mid-motion. It also looked like an older photograph. It wasn't ancient or anything, but something about it suggested to Michael that it was from a few decades ago. As Michael thought about it, He could remember Louis having a couple of girlfriends over the years, but none that seemed to stick around very long. As Michael kept looking at the photograph, he noticed a ring on the woman's finger. The way her hands were posed, some pushing down on the keys, it was fairly easy to see it after a bit of examination. Michael glanced over to the piano again. There were a few trinkets on top, including a small box. Mike looked over towards Louis's room and hesitated. He felt a bit guilty, but curiosity got the better of him. He opened the box. Inside was the same ring, a wedding ring, except for one key difference. Part of it was dented and snapped, like from a violent impact. Michael felt his heart sink. He woke to broom bristles bumping into his side. "Help," Louis said mockingly. "Some homeless man has broken into my house." Michael groggily pushed the broom aside and nearly rolled off the couch. Looking out to nearby windows, he saw that the sun must have been up for hours now. "Wait a minute. No," Louis said. "This is the jerk that punched me in the face. I'm calling 911. "Very funny," Michael mumbled as he sat up. "Are you ever going to let that go?" Louis laughed and set the broom aside. "Not on your life." Michael rubbed his forehead, Louis passing him a mug of steaming coffee. After a sip, Mike asked, "How are you so chipper after last night?" "I have a liver that just won't quit," Louis answered, amused. "Now, are you planning on sitting on my couch all day?" "I just got up, Louis," Mike protested. "What are you, my dad?" "No, I would have whooped you into shape already if I was." "Uh-huh. I got some ideas for today. You doing anything?" "That couch and I have a serious date. That TV might join in as well." "Those solid plans?" "Pretty solid. I'm not going anywhere today." "That's fine," Mike said. "I might just have something in mind if you're okay with it." "What are you thinking?" Michael jerked his head towards the corner. "We're going to tune that piano." Louis shook his head. "Michael, just because you want to—" "Hold on a second," Mike interrupted. "It's not for me. Let me put it this way. After my brother passed, I didn't touch his bike for months. I didn't want to go near it. But after a while, when my folks said they were going to sell it, well, that felt worse. They didn't want it just laying around, though. So finally, I decided to fix it up. I slaved over that thing until it purred, and while it was hard at first, in the end I was glad I did it. It was like a piece of James was still around. Like I'd brought a small bit of joy he felt while riding it back to the world. And that's why I still keep the thing around, up and running." Louis slowly sat down on the couch beside Michael, not looking at him. "What was her name?" Michael finally asked. A tear fell down Louis's cheek. "Michelle," he replied. "Michael," he finally said, "you don't know jack about tuning a piano." "Nope," Michael replied. "Didn't know jack about fixing bikes either. See, there's this wonderful thing called the internet now. With enough patience, you can learn just about anything on there, old man." Louis chuckled. "You aren't going to quit on this, are you?" "Not on your life." Louis thought about it for a long time. "Why don't you ever talk about her?" Michael finally asked tentatively. "Why would I?" Louis replied. "It's not exactly an easy thing. It's not something you just get over." "No, of course not," Michael agreed. "I guess," Louis said, "it's just something you have to work at." "Huh," he said, as if coming to some sort of realization. "What do we need?" he asked. And for the rest of the day, the two bickered and bantered as they tried to figure out just how to get the upright sounding like it used to. Bantering back and forth and debating on who was going to break it first, they soon lost themselves in the task and forgot to eat a couple of times. It was late at night by the time they had finished, and near as they could tell, it was back in tune. Or at least, close as the two non-musicians could tell. Michael hovered his pointer fingers over the keys and then bounced them off the ivories, playing chopsticks, the only other tune he knew. "Eh?" he said, grinning at Louis. Louis closed his eyes for a long moment. "You're a pain and a cliché." Mike grinned from ear to ear and then started back in on the Sabbath. "I am the repairman, learning things on YouTube as fast as I can." "That's it, out," Louis said, laughing. "You've officially overstayed your welcome." All right, Michael said, picking up his things. At the door, he stopped and turned back. I still think we didn't get that F out, Louis insisted. I'm just saying, Mike said as he stepped out the door. If we didn't get it, Louis replied. I can take it from here. Something for me to do, yeah? Michael smiled, genuinely rather than teasing this time. Yeah, he said. They waved and Michael got onto his brother's bike, which he had gone back and picked up between their work that day. Smiling at the bike and feeling good for the first time in months, it finally clicked why. When he had his powers, they were the reason he would get up each day. Well, not them exactly, but rather he got up because he knew each day he might need to use them. But it wasn't like he was worried about each threat, dangerous as they may be. No, it was because his powers gave him a responsibility, and more importantly, gave him a way to help the world. Each time he stepped out in costume, it was an opportunity to help potentially millions of people. Giving people back their lives, it gave his own life meaning. And he had found that again in helping Louis. It was different, and smaller in all rights, and yet, what he had done here today felt bigger in a lot of ways. Reflecting on this, Michael thought maybe there was something else he could do. Some other project he could go work on for someone. Something he could volunteer for, maybe? He remembered once hearing about helping clean up neighborhoods and build new houses down in Mexico. Maybe he'd look into that. May 2020. The spider-like monster ripped through the line of soldiers. Bodies were flung to the side like rag dolls. The gunfire abruptly stopped, allowing for a near silence to descend once more. Except, it wasn't silent really. The whooshing of metal arms and screams of their victims were soon clearly audible. As the last of the group of soldiers fell silent, the eyeless head of the beast turned towards the truck. Oh no, Anna breathed, eyes wide. In a flash, the monster rushed to the back of the truck, its 24 tendrils more than enough to propel it down the road at lightning speed. And then a blinding flash and roar sent a burst of heat and dust into the truck. Anna, Michael, and many others were convinced for a heartbeat that they were dead. But a few moments later, as the dust cleared, they saw what really happened. Firewing had descended on the scene. Changing the heat and pressure of the air around the monster, he was creating explosions that flung the limbs left and right, but were unable to penetrate the eggshell body. One limb sliced for the flying hero, and he quickly jerked out of the way. The tentacle slammed into the asphalt, and by the look of Firewing's quickly working fingers, he was adjusting its density to try and trap the limb. No luck, it yanked itself free, and then 7 or 8 of the tentacles went flying towards the truck. Firewing flew in front of them, and a dozen explosions repelled the striking tendrils, just like Mike had seen him do on TV, blocking the creature's view. Go! He shouted back unnecessarily towards the truck. His wall of fire didn't last long. 10 tendrils quickly fanned back and forth above the burning ground. Except the ground wasn't really burning. Firewing was creating the fire just above it, and without any other fuel aside from air, it was easily brushed out. Firewing immediately spun around and started unleashing explosions, but with all of the tentacles flying through the air, he was getting overwhelmed. The monster advanced and he started to fly backwards to get away, but one of the tendrils slashed through his right wing, ripping a chunk of the back of his costume with it. He tumbled, rolled, and a harsh wind tossed him back to his feet, and he immediately returned to batting away the attacking tendrils. And then, planting his feet, he tossed away the rest of his wings and really let loose. A hurricane of wind and explosions materialized around him and the creature. It was nearly blown off its feet, and well over half of its tendrils quickly slammed into the ground, and then, as they broke away, started slithering around posts, poles, and any other structures they could find just to try to keep the monster from flying away. But each of these poles or other grips in turn started to weaken, and the monster kept losing its grip. For a moment, it really looked like it was going to be blown away. But there were too many tentacles. It was managing to pull itself closer and closer to Firewing until its small body was just over him. One tendril slipped through, striking Firewing's arm, and it was over. With one arm down, the hurricane abated, just enough for another 3 tendrils to break through the onslaught of explosions and pin Firewing. "No!" Anna exclaimed involuntarily. A final tentacle slammed down on the back of Firewing's head, driving him into the asphalt. And then it started to drain. Firewing tried to fight, and they could see his limbs struggle, but slowly they abated, and then the tendrils pinning them retracted. Firewing lay motionless. And then the truck flipped. Doing a full 360 along its long axis, the truck threw its passengers against each other and the walls. Anna was thrown into Dr. Weller, who who landed on top of Michael. Louis was lost under a pile of 3 others, and then they were shuffled again. When they finally came to a stop, Hannah was buried under 2 others. She pushed herself up while trying to lift those on top of her. And suddenly, sunlight spilled into the truck, as what was now the top was torn off. Silver tendrils rushed into the compartment and started snatching people in seconds. Before the moans had subsided from the crash, screams filled the air. Hannah felt a slick metallic limb slither around her waist and begin to pull her from the truck's wreckage. She tried to pull herself from its grip, but it was already lifting her into the air. Out of nowhere, Louis leapt up and grabbed Anna's legs. "Turn and slip out of its grip," he instructed briskly. Before Anna could reply, Louis tugged, and she spun, instinctively following his orders. She slid through the open end of the tentacle's grip and rolled onto the asphalt. Turning to glance at the scene, she saw the metal monstrosity lifting 6 people into the air, dangling them from their heads over the edge of the bridge they had found themselves on. The ruined truck lay about 15 feet behind her, the creature 20 ahead. On either side, there was a steep plunge into the river below. Michael ran past her, his brown jacket fluttering behind him as he rushed towards the nearest tentacle, subduing a helpless civilian. Another tentacle was poised to grip his forehead. Michael grabbed the rearing tendril and tried to pull it aside, but it only moved a few inches, even as the massive man put all his strength into it. "Michael!" Louis shouted. "Wait!" Anna Garcia had just a moment to glance back at the scene before Dr. Weller slipped his arm around her and lifted her to her feet. "We should go too. There's nothing we can do," he said grimly. Anna could tell the words burned as they left his throat, but she didn't argue. As the 2 sprinted off, Michael continued to wrestle with the single tendril. The man behind him was lifted into the air by the other tendril, which had already wrapped around him. "No!" Michael roared between clenched teeth. Louis was suddenly behind him. "Michael, you can't. And that's okay." Michael swallowed. He didn't release his grip. "No, it's not," he seethed. "There are some things not even you can do," Louis said. His tone was low and soft. Michael gripped the tendril once more as his eyes began to water. Yet another tentacle swam up through the air and made its way towards the spectacled man now being held above them. The one Michael couldn't save. "No, wait, I have a family. You can't do this!" he cried, but if the machine heard, it didn't care. It grabbed his skull, squeezing out a blood-curdling scream from the man, and then began to drain. His scream became a guttural grunt as his skin paled and his flesh shriveled. A last gurgle left his throat as the light left his eyes. Then the tentacle released him. The dried husk hit the ground. Michael stared in horror. The dead eyes looked back to him. He roared and pushed the tentacle further away. "Michael, no!" Louis shouted. "We have to go!" And then another chrome limb slithered towards Louis, inches above the pavement. Wrapping itself around his ankle, it abruptly lifted him by the legs into the air. "Louis!" Michael screamed. "Michael, listen to me," he said, his steady voice starting to shake as he dangled upside down, a tendril already making its way to his forehead. "Everything will be fine as long as you survive. Run." "I won't leave you," Michael shouted back. "You don't have a choice," Louis said. "Save yourself." Just as the end of the tentacle touched Louis's forehead, he looked Michael in the eyes, and in the steadiest voice he could muster, he said, "You must survive." And then it clamped down. Louis let out a pained moan, which was cut short by a sudden gasp. Just as with the man before, Louis's skin began to pale and dry up. "No! Louis!" Michael shouted, tossing aside the tendril, but it quickly wrapped back around his chest. Louis's flesh seemed to dry out and shrink, his figure becoming ever so slightly skeletal as the seconds passed by. And worst of all, his sparkling brown eyes suddenly became dull and clouded. "Louis!" Michael screamed at the top of his lungs. The tentacle released his forehead, leaving behind a round mark where it had been. And then the tentacle around his feet dropped him. Michael watched in horror as Louis's body fell past, as he too was lifted into the air now. And then the limp form hit the pavement. Anna Garcia and Dr. Weller felt the explosion. It wasn't from a bomb or a rocket, but the impact hit their chests just as hard. Like a drumbeat against their ribcage, they felt the wave of pressure pass over and through them. The air was electric, and the hair on their necks began to stand up. A heat, as if from a setting sun, was pressing on their backs. It wasn't unbearable, but powerful. Comforting even, Anna thought. Dr. Weller's eyes widened. "It can't be," he said under his breath. "What is it?" Anna asked. Both turned at the same time, slowly, to look back towards the monster. The metal limb ripped in two, and Michael landed on the bridge. He felt the familiar electricity spark around him. The power welled up inside, flowing from a nearly endless well. He felt it all returning. But at the moment, he didn't care. He was about to rip every leg off this monstrosity, and then split it down the middle. He was mad, and nothing in the world was going to stop him. Invincible took a step forward. As this mechanical monster continues its slaughter, it finds itself face to face with a new challenge, the mighty hero Invincible. Even with all its destructive potential, will it be able to stand up to the raging super? And why did Invincible's powers disappear in the first place? Will they last long enough to stop this beast? Find out next time on the Mirage Barrage.